Walk out ahead of me. That man's a murderer. What's your boy doing with a gun in his hand?
What have you got, Lieutenant?
50 fresh horses in the pasture quarter of a mile south. Guns and ammunition in the basement of the hardware store being held for a new company of recruits.
Randolph Scott starred in over 100 films, stood tall as one of Hollywood's most iconic cowboys, and became the very symbol of American masculinity. When he passed away in 1987, a handwritten letter was discovered among his belongings. And what it revealed shook the legacy of this silent hero. Could this quiet confession finally explain the decades of whispers surrounding his private life? Join us as we uncover the untold story behind Randolph Scott's final letter. The Man Behind the Cowboy. Randolph Scott's story begins far from the dusty trails of the Wild West. He was born George Randolph Scott on January 23, 1898, in Orange County, Virginia. Not long after, his family moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where Scott would grow up in a life of comfort and opportunity. His father, George Grant Scott, was a successful certified public accountant, and his mother, Lucille Crane Scott, focused on raising Randolph and his siblings. The Scotts were well off and well connected, part of a respectable Southern social class that valued education, tradition, and personal discipline. As a young man, Scott had access to private schooling and later enrolled in college at the Georgia Institute of Technology. There, he studied engineering, a field that reflected both his logical mind and the structured upbringing his family had encouraged.
200 and 300 butter.
Oh, Jeff, quit bluffing. I'm calling you.
However, his life took a sharp turn when the United States entered World War I. Like many young men of his generation, Scott felt a sense of duty and patriotism, and he put his studies on hold to join the U.S. Army. During the war, Scott served in France as part of the 2nd Trench Mortar Battalion. Though he didn't see heavy combat, the experience was intense and formative. Life in the trenches was physically and mentally demanding. Even without being on the front lines, Scott would have lived in harsh conditions and seen firsthand the emotional toll of war. This experience stayed with him. Friends and colleagues later described him as calm, serious, and deeply mature, traits that often showed up in the characters he played on screen. The military gave Scott more than discipline. It gave him a strong sense of purpose and identity. He learned how to stay focused under pressure, how to take responsibility, and how to carry himself with quiet strength. These qualities became part of who he was, both in real life and in the roles he would later take on as an actor. After returning home from the war, he briefly resumed his life in North Carolina. But something inside him had changed. He couldn't settle back into his old life. Feeling restless and curious about the world, Scott looked westward toward Hollywood. The film industry was booming in the early 1920s, and many young people were drawn to the excitement of acting and filmmaking.
And say thank you and get shot because that's his job? Why doesn't he go to work for Charlie Fair where there's a future?
With his father's encouragement, Scott packed up and moved to California. At first, he was just another aspiring actor among thousands, taking acting classes and working in small roles as an extra in silent films. But Scott had something that made him stand out. His tall frame, striking looks, and natural athletic ability made him a perfect fit for action-heavy roles. He also had a serious, grounded presence that directors noticed. One of the key turning points in his early career came when he met the legendary filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille. DeMille, known for his epic productions and keen eye for talent, saw something promising in Scott. He began casting him in minor roles in some of his early sound films. These opportunities gave Scott valuable exposure and taught him the mechanics of being in front of the camera. More importantly, it allowed him to work closely with Hollywood's best directors and actors, sharpening his craft and learning the business from the inside out. Rise to fame in Hollywood. Scott's big break came in the late 1920s and early 1930s. As talking pictures became more popular, he transitioned smoothly from silent films into speaking roles. His early films, like The Virginian and The Last Roundup hinted at the screen presence he would soon be known for: quiet, commanding, and intensely focused. He began getting more substantial roles, often cast as a cowboy or soldier. Audiences responded to him. He wasn't flashy or loud. He brought a quiet intensity to his roles that people found both believable and comforting. By the mid-1930s, Scott had firmly planted himself in the Western genre. This would be where he made his mark, starring in film after film that helped define the style and tone of the American Western. Movies like Last of the Mohicans, Jesse James, and Western Union turned him into a household name. These films showed him as a strong but thoughtful man who fought for what was right, usually with a sense of personal justice, rather than by the law. What made Randolph Scott stand out among Western stars was his ability to portray a more complex kind of hero. He wasn't just a gunslinger or a sheriff. He played characters who had deep values, a sense of honor, and a strong personal code. They were often men who had been through difficult times and had learned how to survive while holding on to their beliefs. He didn't speak much in his roles. He didn't need to. His facial expressions, body language, and presence said enough. That kind of silent strength was rare and powerful.
Mr. John Smith. You've certainly got a lot of relatives around here.
I come from a big family. You know Jules Moret?
Scott's screen presence was a reflection of traditional American values at the time: bravery, responsibility, fairness, and humility. These values matched what many people believed made a real man. His characters were honest, sometimes flawed, but always true to themselves. Whether he was riding through the desert or standing up to outlaws, Scott's roles were a consistent reminder of what it meant to be moral and steady in a world full of chaos. His performances often emphasized personal independence. He played men who could handle themselves, who didn't rely on others, and who faced challenges with calm determination. In many ways, he became a symbol of the self-made man, someone who didn't talk much, didn't show weakness, but who always did the right thing. It's this quiet heroism that made Scott so appealing, especially during the hard times of the Great Depression and World War II, when American audiences were looking for strength and hope. By the 1950s, Scott had fully stepped into the role of a seasoned Western legend. He teamed up with director Bud Boetticher for a series of films that would become known as some of the best Westerns ever made. But it was in these earlier decades, shaped by war, discipline, and his rise through Hollywood, that the foundation of his screen identity was built. Scott's cowboy roles weren't just acting. They were a reflection of the real man, serious, honest, and strong, both on screen and off. A life of privacy. While Randolph Scott was known across America as a rugged, heroic figure in film, his real life was very different from the wild stories of the Old West. Off-screen, Scott was private, reserved, and focused on his family and faith. He lived in a quiet, calm way that was very unlike the drama of the characters he played. Though he starred in more than 100 films, he never let fame control his life. Scott's personal life was always something he kept close. In 1936, he married Marion DuPont, who came from the wealthy and influential DuPont family. Their marriage, however, didn't last long. The two divorced just 3 years later in 1939. Not much was said publicly about the reason behind their split. Even during the divorce, Scott avoided publicity or gossip. That was typical of him. He kept his private life just that, private. It wasn't until 1944 that he found a lasting partner. That year, Scott married Patricia Stillman. Their marriage was stable, loving, and long-lasting. The couple stayed together until Scott's death in 1987, a union that lasted over 40 years. Together, they adopted 2 children, Christopher and Sandra. Scott was known to be a devoted husband and a caring father. He kept his family out of the spotlight.
You're a stranger around here. My name is Jake Hooper.
Is it?
How do you like it?
and made sure they lived as normally as possible despite his fame. Scott also lived his life according to his strong Christian faith.
He's a fine lawyer. And now that he's going to be one of us, we'll finally have some law in Ocotillo.
We're glad to have you settle here, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you.
Religion was a big part of who he was. Friends and family said he was deeply spiritual, often attending church and quietly supporting Christian charities. He didn't talk about his beliefs in interviews or use his platform for religious messages, but those who knew him understood that his faith guided his decisions and how he treated others. After he retired from acting in 1962, Scott didn't try to stay in the public eye. Instead, he embraced a peaceful life. He and Patricia lived in Beverly Hills, where they focused on their family, their faith, and the things they enjoyed. Scott loved golf and played regularly at the Bel Air Country Club. He also stayed active in his community, especially in Christian organizations and charitable events. Even though he was one of the most famous actors of his time, he didn't crave attention. He didn't appear at award shows, didn't host parties, and didn't look for praise. This quiet lifestyle wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Scott didn't like the gossip or drama that often came with Hollywood fame. He rarely gave interviews and was never involved in public scandals. While some of his fellow stars were chased by tabloids and rumors, Scott kept his name out of the headlines. He was careful about what he said, where he went, and who he trusted. His strong moral code, shaped by his faith and military experience, helped him avoid many of the traps that came with celebrity life.
How'd they get out? Started before you were in place. We had to go in.
All of them break at once?
But there was a certain irony in the way Scott lived. On screen, he played characters who were often full of emotion, even if they didn't always show it with words. His roles were deep and thoughtful, men dealing with loss, guilt, love, and justice. Audiences felt connected to these characters because they seemed real and raw. Yet the man playing them was emotionally guarded in real life. He didn't reveal much about his feelings. Even those close to him said that he was quiet, polite, and thoughtful, but not very open about his emotions. He had a way of keeping people at a distance. This made Scott both fascinating and mysterious. People admired him for his discipline and clean reputation, but it also made them wonder what he was really like when the cameras were off. Fans could only guess at the inner world of Randolph Scott, because he never shared much of it publicly. He lived with poise and grace, always respectful, always calm. But behind that calm exterior, there may have been more going on than most people ever knew. By choosing to live outside the spotlight, Scott preserved his dignity and gave his family a life of peace. He also left behind a legacy that felt pure and unspoiled. There were no scandals attached to his name, no public fallouts, and no big controversies. He exited Hollywood on his own terms, with his reputation and integrity fully intact. But behind that perfect image, a hidden truth would one day come to light, something that changed how we see the man behind the cowboy. Hollywood rumors and repression. In Hollywood's golden age, some stories were never spoken aloud, but traveled quietly from person to person, carried more by whispers than facts. One of those long-standing stories involved Randolph Scott and Cary Grant, two of the most handsome and admired actors of their time. Their relationship sparked curiosity, rumors, and speculation that lasted for decades. It wasn't just because they were friends, it was because they lived together, and they did so for years. In the early 1930s, before either of them reached the peak of their fame, Randolph Scott and Cary Grant shared a house in Santa Monica, California. It was a beautiful beachside home where they reportedly lived like any other pair of roommates. But the length of time they lived together, around 12 years, was unusual, especially for two leading men in Hollywood. Even more striking were the public photos that showed them together in relaxed domestic settings, lounging by the pool, dressed in matching outfits, and, in one of the most discussed images, wearing frilly aprons while standing side by side, gazing into each other's eyes. To the public at the time, these photos may have seemed quirky or simply playful. But as time passed and social norms shifted, those same images were re-examined through a different lens. People began asking whether there was more to their bond than just friendship. Fans, writers, and Hollywood insiders all started to wonder about the nature of the relationship between Randolph Scott and Cary Grant. Some believed they were simply close friends. Others believed it was something deeper, something romantic. Their living arrangement didn't last forever. As their careers took off and the pressure of fame grew, they moved out and began living separately. But even after that, their friendship remained strong, and they stayed in touch throughout their lives. The rumors, however, never went away. Cary Grant's parallel journey. At the same time, Cary Grant's life was also filled with similar questions. Over the years, a number of people close to him have come forward with stories that paint a clearer picture of Grant's personal life. One of the most important sources was designer Ori Kelly, who had a long romantic relationship with Grant before Grant became a star. In Ori Kelly's memoir, published many years after his death, he described their life together in New York and how Grant changed as fame pulled him deeper into Hollywood's strict expectations. Another source of information came from Scotty Bowers, a former Marine and Hollywood insider who later became known for arranging discreet sexual encounters for many stars. In interviews and in his book, Bowers described setting up Grant with other men during his Hollywood years. These claims, while controversial, were supported by others who knew Grant personally. Although Grant never publicly confirmed any of this, the amount of evidence, including long-term friendships and relationships, made it hard to ignore. But why was it all kept secret? The answer lies in the world of 1940s and 1950s Hollywood, a time when image meant everything, and the studios had full control over how stars were seen. Back then, being openly gay in Hollywood was not just risky, it was career-ending. The film industry, like much of society at the time, was not accepting of homosexuality. Studios worked hard to protect the images of their stars, sometimes arranging fake relationships or even marriages to keep rumors away. Tabloids were quick to publish anything scandalous, and just the suggestion that an actor might be gay could destroy their public image and end their career. This is the world Randolph Scott and Cary Grant lived in. Even if their relationship was romantic, they would have had every reason to keep it quiet. For Grant, that meant carefully planned relationships with women, several high-profile marriages, and never speaking publicly about the men in his life. For Scott, it meant total silence. Scott never addressed the rumors at any point in his life. He didn't deny them. He didn't confirm them. He simply stayed quiet. In a way, his silence was in line with the rest of his life. He was always a private person, someone who avoided the spotlight when he wasn't working. But in this case, the silence carried more weight. It was about survival, the cost of speaking the truth. If that truth would have confirmed the rumors, might have been losing everything: his career, his reputation, and his place in American culture as the symbol of the strong, straight, silent cowboy. That silence, though, may have come at a personal cost. Living in secret for years, being unable to fully express your love or your identity, can leave emotional scars. In Scott's case, many believe that the loneliness and restraint he wrote about later in life were signs of a man who had spent much of his life hiding an important part of who he was. While he built a public image based on strength, honor, and stability, the man behind that image may have felt alone and misunderstood. By staying silent, Scott protected his career and reputation. But he may have also given up something even more important: his chance to live openly and fully. That was the price many stars of his time had to pay. Society simply didn't allow for another way. And so many lived lives that were only partly true. In the years since both Scott and Grant passed away, the world has changed. There is now much more openness and acceptance around sexuality in the entertainment industry. Looking back, many people feel sympathy for stars like Scott, who didn't have the freedom to be themselves. Their silence wasn't weakness. It was self-protection in a world that gave them no safe alternative. But one final private letter would soon change everything, finally giving voice to the quiet pain Scott carried for so long. The final letter. When Randolph Scott passed away in 1987, at the age of 89, the world remembered him as a legend of the silver screen. For decades, he had been the face of the classic American Western, calm, strong, and honorable. He died peacefully in Beverly Hills, having retired from public life decades earlier. His passing didn't make headlines the way modern celebrities do, but for fans of old Hollywood and classic Westerns, it marked the end of an era. What no one expected, however, was that his final words, left behind in a handwritten note, would open a door into the most private part of his life. The letter wasn't meant for the public. It was found among his personal belongings shortly after his death. Some say it was tucked inside a worn Bible. Others say it was left in a drawer in his study. Wherever it was kept, it was clear that Scott had written it not for fame or attention, but as a final act of honesty for those closest to him. It was addressed generally to his family and close friends, a small circle of people who had respected his deep desire for privacy throughout his life. The note was short, only a couple of pages, but it carried a lot of weight. The tone was soft, thoughtful, and deeply personal. It wasn't written with bitterness or anger. Instead, it felt like a quiet reflection from someone who had spent a lifetime holding things in. It was not a dramatic tell-all or a detailed confession. It was more like a release, a way to finally say the things he had never been able to say aloud. In the letter, Scott wrote about loneliness. He admitted that even though he had lived a life many people admired, there were times he had felt deeply alone. He mentioned how hard it had been to live under the constant pressure of public expectations. He didn't call out anyone by name, and he didn't speak in detail about any one person, but he did talk about missed chances, emotional walls, and a lifelong effort to keep his truest self hidden. Scott described how difficult it was to carry the weight of being an image, not just an actor, but a symbol of something larger. He said that while the roles he played often reflected strength and truth, his own truth had to be kept inside. One of the most emotional parts of the note was where he hinted at regret, not for the career he built, but for the emotional distance he kept from those he loved. He didn't name Cary Grant, but many who have seen or read parts of the letter believe there are clear signs that he was speaking about a deeply important relationship that he couldn't live out publicly. He didn't express shame, only sadness. It was not about guilt, but about missed chances. He longed for a world that could have allowed him to be more open, more honest. Scott also touched on his Christian faith, which had always been a quiet but central part of his life. He explained that he never felt he was living against his beliefs, but that he had learned over the years that compassion, understanding, and grace were far more powerful than judgment. This part of the note, family members later said, showed how at peace he had become with himself in his final years. The letter didn't give all the answers people might want. There were no shocking details, no explicit truths spelled out. But what it did reveal was something far more human. A man who had struggled to balance who he really was with who the world needed him to be. The real Randolph Scott was not just the cowboy hero with a quiet gaze and steady hand. He was also a person who, like many, had to make difficult choices in a time when being different was not accepted. This quiet confession allowed people to see the emotional cost of fame in a different light. It also added a deeper, more personal meaning to the characters he had played on screen. His roles had always been stoic, controlled, even lonely at times. After reading the note, it's easier to understand why those characters felt so real. Scott didn't just act those roles, he lived parts of them. Friends and family who read the letter said it brought both sadness and healing. Some had always suspected there was more to Scott than what the public saw. Others were surprised by how deeply he had felt things he never talked about. But most of them agreed on one thing: the letter wasn't about scandal. It was about truth. And in its own quiet way, it was a powerful reminder that everyone, even the strongest among us, has inner struggles. From myth to man. When Randolph Scott's private letter was found after his death in 1987, it caused a quiet but meaningful shift in how people saw him. The man once known for playing calm, moral, and emotionally reserved cowboys was suddenly being viewed in a much more human way. The letter revealed feelings he had kept hidden his entire life: loneliness, regret, and a longing for honesty. It didn't just touch those who knew him personally. It reached fans, historians, and members of the LGBTQ+ community who found new meaning in both his life and his work. The first reactions to the letter were mixed, but overall, many people felt a deep sense of compassion. Fans who had loved Scott for his on-screen strength now saw that he had carried emotional weight off-screen as well. It made him more relatable. People respected his choice to keep his private life quiet, but reading the letter also brought a better understanding of what that silence may have cost him. Film historians began to look at his career differently. They had always admired his work, especially his performances in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when he partnered with director Bud Boetticher to make some of his most complex and powerful films. But now, there was a new layer to explore. Could it be that the restraint and calm Scott showed on screen reflected something much deeper going on inside? In many of his films, Scott played characters who didn't say much, who kept their feelings under control, and who always chose duty over emotion. In the past, this was seen as a classic example of American masculinity: strong, quiet, and controlled. But after the letter was revealed, critics started asking, was that just a role? Or was it actually a reflection of who he really was? Knowing now that Scott may have struggled with emotional isolation, his performances take on a new meaning. His characters often seemed like they were holding something back, not just anger or sadness, but connection. There's a certain heaviness in his eyes in some scenes, a sense that he's protecting something deep inside. That may not have been just acting. It could have been a reflection of the emotional control he practiced in real life. Some LGBTQ+ film historians began re-evaluating Scott's place in queer cinema history. While he had never been considered part of that conversation before, now he was being included in broader discussions about actors who lived in the shadows of the Hollywood system. His story joined others like Cary Grant, Rock Hudson, and Montgomery Clift, men who were seen as symbols of masculinity, but who had hidden parts of themselves to keep their careers and safety intact. This also led to a deeper conversation about the stoic cowboy archetype in American media. For decades, the cowboy had been portrayed as emotionally distant, morally certain, and physically strong. Scott had helped shape that image. But now, people were asking whether that toughness was always genuine, or if it was sometimes a mask. Could it be that the silence and restraint we associate with cowboy characters were actually signs of emotional struggle? Directors and actors today are also more open to showing emotional depth in traditionally strong characters, in part because stories like Scott's challenge old ideas of masculinity. The idea that a man has to be silent, unfeeling, and isolated to be strong is starting to change. Randolph Scott, through his letter and his legacy, played a part in that shift, even if he never intended to. If you liked this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss the next story from Classic Hollywood.